So which are the indicators that we're running through today? The RLI, the protected areas.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from around the world. We're very glad to have you with the last of our 4 webinars on proposed headline indicators for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And these webinars are being organised by the United Nations Environment Programme, World Conservation Monitoring Centre, UNEP-WCMC, and the Secretariat to the Convention on Biological Diversity. My name is Philip Bubb. I'm going to be chairing this session. And before I go further, I'd just like to quickly cover some housekeeping. We'd like to notify you that today's session will be recorded and made available on YouTube. Your microphone will be muted and your camera will be off during the webinar. And if you'd like to comment, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And we have a Q&A, question and answer function as well. So if you want to make a question, please do put it in the Q&A section. If it's to a particular presenter, please say who your question is to. We will maybe take some of the questions during the presentation, but we will also have a session at the end to address the questions and answers. And if you have any technical issues, please send a message in chat to technical support. Thank you. Next slide, please. So, this is the last of our 4 webinars, and the aim is to introduce the metadata for the headline indicators that have been proposed in the first draft of the monitoring framework for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. When we say metadata, that's data about data, information about the indicators. So the aim is to help everybody understand the indicators, what their status is and what they're. So the presentations are by the organisations that provide or are developing the proposed headline indicators in the draft monitoring framework. Next slide, please. And so this is the last of our 4 webinars, the last 5 indicators we're going to be presenting, and therefore CBD parties and other actors involved in the development of the monitoring framework and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to help you understand what they measure in relation to the goals and targets, their methods and data sources, their potential national level use, their availability, are they ready now or are they still in development, and for you to get to know who produces the indicators. Please note that not all the headline indicators are being presented in these webinars due to limited availability of some of the speakers who could present them, and also because some of the indicators are still at the conceptual stage. Next slide, please. So this is to show where we are on the pathway to COP15 later this year. We're at the first dot on the left there, presentation of on the metadata for the proposed headline indicators and questions and answers about them. And with that, UNEP-WCMC is preparing an information document to go to Substar 24 on this information on the metadata. And we'll be hearing a bit about that in a minute in the webinar. And that information will be available for peer review. And that will then feed into the discussions on the monitoring framework at Substar 24. And then also in April, a technical indicator meeting is being organised to discuss the suitability and availability of indicators, and the results of that and other outcomes from Substar 24 will be put into background papers which will go to COP15. Next slide, please. So just want to clarify that these webinars and the Substar 24 information document that UNEP-WCMC are compiling, they don't provide an analysis of the suitability of the indicators for measuring progress towards the goals and targets. This will come through the peer review of this information and the discussions at Substar 24, and also will be one of the aims to look at in the expert meeting that's being organised next month by UNEP-WCMC with the Secretariat of the CBD and the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership. And as I said, there will be an information document coming out of that April meeting to inform the subsequent discussions of COP15. Next slide, please. So this is our program for today. We've got 90 minutes session. So in a minute, I'm going to invite, if he's on the line, I wasn't sure at the beginning, the Substar chair, Sika Benitez. We had some technical difficulties at the start of the webinar for people to come on. Let me just looking. No, I don't think Sika is with us. Oh, he is. Great. He is. Good. So thanks. So great. So in a minute, I'll ask Ezekiel to give us an introduction to the draft monitoring framework and how in relation to the negotiations and where these webinars are part of that. And then I heard from a UNEP-WCMC colleague about this metadata on the headline indicators. Then we will be covering, we'll have introductions to the 5 indicators that I've got presented here. Then we'll have about 15-20 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So please do post your questions in the Q&A function. And we will have some closing remarks at the end, just for 5 minutes. Next slide, please. So just to say how this session will be run, that each presentation is about 6, 7, 8 minutes. I might take a question or two after each one if there's time, and please do put your questions as they come up. Some of the speakers might answer the questions in written form in the Q&A function, and we'll take them at the end as well. And if you have any additional queries to the indicator providers, you can contact them directly or via this UNEP-WCMC helpdesk email, info@indicators.net, and we'll facilitate that communication. And just to remind you, these webinars are being recorded and will be available on YouTube, where there's translation to other languages. Next slide, please. So I would now like to invite Sika Benitez, the chair of Substar, to give us a little introduction to how these webinars are part of supporting the negotiations for the frameworks.
Thank you very much, Philip. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 4th technical webinar on indicators, organized to support information sharing around the monitoring framework for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. A draft monitoring framework was prepared prior to part 1 of Substar 24 meeting as document Substar 24.3 add 1. And an updated version of this document is currently online as non-paper for Substar 24 part 2. This non-paper will serve as the starting point for negotiations that we will have on the monitoring framework in the upcoming weeks. Actually, we start next Monday. All of the indicators presented in this webinar are currently included as headline indicators in the draft monitoring framework. And I've been working with the Secretariat and WCMC to ensure parties have information on the technical specificities of existing indicators methodologies. These webinars are presenting indicators which are already at an advanced stage of development. For the others that are not in such an advanced stage, this will need to be developed further if they are maintained in the monitoring framework. But a technical presentation of such as the one today is not possible for these indicators. Additionally, the selection of which indicators are being presented for different days, this is the 4th day, has been largely based on the availability of different global experts. I would like to thank all the experts who have agreed to present these indicators, and I apologize to participants that we were not able to group the indicators by goal or targets due to the availability of the experts. In terms of how these webinars relate to the upcoming SBSTA meeting, I will reestablish in SBSTA a contact group on the monitoring framework chaired by Andy Stott from the UK and Alfred Otenjebois of Ghana. This group will be expected to assess the suitability of specific headline indicators vis-a-vis the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will continue negotiations, including the national and global applicability of these indicators. It is expected that we will have about 5 sessions of this contact group in Geneva. I hope that this webinar will provide information which can inform the discussion in terms of the indicators that are being presented today. And as you saw, we will see interesting topics today, like the monetary benefits and non-monetary benefits, indicators on operational, legislative, administrative policy frameworks, which ensure fair and equitable sharing, the Redless index, and the coverage of protected areas and other effective conservation measures. It will be interesting. This is the last webinar of this series of 4. So I do thank WCMC and CBD Secretariat for supporting the development of this series of 4 webinars ending today, and to all of you for joining us today. Good luck and see you in Geneva. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ezekiel. Thank you. Yes, we're running right up to Geneva next week. So the following presentations, I will ask the speakers to keep to time. If necessary, I'll give the speakers a 2-minute notice, please, to finish up. But next, I would like to invite my colleague from UNEP-WCMC, Matea Vukalit, to present the information on metadata for the proposed indicators.
Thank you, Philip. I hope you can hear me good. Hello, everybody. And as Philip said, I'm going to give a brief overview of the work we've been doing in collecting metadata templates for the proposed headline indicators in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. So we have been collecting metadata for those proposed headline indicators, and we prepared a template you can see on your screen on your right. We have sent this template to the organizations responsible for providing or developing these proposed headline indicators in the current draft. This template is loosely based on the template used to gather information on indicators used to measure progress towards sustainable development goals. But we have adjusted this template according to our aim, which was to gather as much information as possible to aid in the upcoming processes for developing post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. I just want to mention there is a selection criteria for indicators in the monitoring framework, which are proposed in these 2 documents you can see on your screen. I'm just going to give a quick overview of what those selection criteria is, because it's related to the metadata presented today. So the metadata related to the indicator are or will be publicly available. Methodology is published in a peer-reviewed academic journal or has gone through some kind of scientific peer review process. Indicators should be regularly updated with a time lag less than 5 years between updates. There's already existing mechanisms for maintaining these indicators, for example, by a member of Biodiversity Indicator Partnership. But headline indicators, they should be able to be used in national reporting and support national planning processes. And also methodologies for these indicators should be agreed by parties and calculated based on national data provided or validated by parties. Next slide, please. So the data so far, we have collated all this metadata and did some preliminary analysis based on what's been provided by us by indicator producers. So far, we have collated full metadata sheets for 26 of the 39 proposed headline indicators. For the indicators that are in the early stage of development or in the conceptual stage, we provided a reduced short version of the template, which provides information on what is proposed for those indicators and how it might be gathered. If we just look at the pie chart on the screen, we can see that we have the exact same number of indicators that are available today as we do for the ones that need of development. So the pie chart on the blue section shows 40% of those indicators available today, 40% of those need in development, and 20% of the indicators that are in development stage, which means they'll be ready within the next 2 years. We also looked at a scale of the indicator coverage. Is it a global indicator? Is the data being collated on a national level, or whatever there is a national methodology available? On the box on your right, we just wanted to highlight which indicators are available today, which are in development, and for the ones that further work is needed, for example, especially goals D and those latter targets in the draft 19, 20, and 21. Next slide, please. The next thing we looked at is relating to that selection criteria is whether or not those proposed indicators are adopted for use for other MEAs and processes. And what we found is 18 of the proposed headline indicators are used for measuring progress towards other MEAs and processes. 15 indicators are reported to be adapted for measuring progress towards sustainable development goals. 5 indicators are used in assessment for IPBES. 2 indicators are also cited in the strategic plan for migratory species under the CMS. And 5 proposed indicators are peer reviewed by the Biodiversity Indicator Partnership. I just want to highlight from this work, we haven't looked at whether those proposed indicators, how often are they being used, or are they being used for those adopted processes? And also how frequently are they being used in national reporting? Next slide, please. It is also important to mention what we haven't considered in this work, and that is the suitability of the proposed indicators in response to corresponding drafts and targets and goals and targets. Rationale of the indicator, is it a good measure in the relation to corresponding draft and targets? Methodology. Also specifics around data collection, who needs to gather this data and what's the capacity need for it. Suitability and accessibility of indicator output. Geographical range, for example, if some parts of the world are covered better than others. And also proposed time series. Next slide, please. In terms of next steps, so metadata sheets are collated into an information document, which will be available for peer review. The metadata template itself will be available for peer review. Also, metadata sheets will be available for peer review by expert community, including members of the Biodiversity Indicator Partnership. And as Philip mentioned, we will also hold an in-person expert technical meeting in April, co-hosted by the CBD Secretariat and UNEP-WCMC, to look at the outcomes of SAPSTA, the results of the peer review process, and also to look at the availability and suitability of the proposed indicators. Then a document will be provided to COP15 on these findings from all of these processes. Next slide, please. For the end, I just wanted to mention a couple of resources. So in addition to this information document I just mentioned, metadata sheets will be also made available on our post-2020 indicators website. There's also an information document, SAPSTA 24, information document 16, where you can find more data about the criteria that might be helpful for indicator selection. And we also wanted to encourage parties to get in touch with us at info@bipindicators.net if there's any further information they would like to have about the indicators that we can provide to them, and also how would they like to receive that information. Next slide, please. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. So if you have questions about that, please do put them in the Q&A section. So next, we are going to have a presentation on the Redless Index. We have 2 of the experts on this, Thomas Brooks, Chief Scientist from International Union for Conservation of Nature, and Stuart Butchart, Chief Scientist of BirdLife International. I think Tom is going to give the presentation, and both Tom and Stuart will be available for answering questions at the end. Tom, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Philip. Hello, friends and colleagues around the world. I hope that you're all safe and well, and much look forward to welcoming many of you here in Switzerland over coming weeks. I'm Tom Brooks, IUCN Chief Scientist, and presenting jointly here with Stu Butchart, Chief Scientist at BirdLife International. And many thanks indeed to WCMC and to the CBD for the opportunity to present the Red List Index as a headline indicator for the proposed Global Biodiversity Framework Goal A in this webinar today. Next slide, please. Now, of course, species extinction is the most fundamental and irreversible of human-caused environmental impacts. And so having an indicator to track this is fundamental to delivery of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Specifically, the Red List Index measures change in aggregate extinction risk across entire groups of species. It's a long established indicator. It was first published back in 2004 with aggregate data across multiple species groups available back to the early 1990s and indeed back into the 1980s for some species groups. Next slide, please. The Red List Index methodology is based on tracking genuine changes in the number of species in each category of quantitatively determined extinction risk on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, expressed as changes in an index ranging from 0, where all species are assessed as extinct, up to 1, where all species in the group in question are assessed as least concern. So for example, consider the European bison, which in 2000 was assessed as endangered on the Red List. Click, please. Through to 2008, where as a result of conservation actions, it was reassessed as vulnerable, so a genuine change in the positive direction. One more click, please. And now in the year 2000, it was reassessed as near threatened. So three genuine category changes, a conservation success story so far in this case. These step changes in extinction risk category are factored in alongside the extinction risk of all other species in the groups in question to generate the Red List Index. Next slide, please. The data flow for generating the Red List Index, of course, works from an interplay between national and global scales. First, many countries, of course, maintain national red lists, typically updated on a decadal timescale, although some are updated over faster timeframes. Next click, please. Where these assess the extinction risk of nationally endemic species, the SIS Connect tool then allows their interoperability with the global Red List of Threatened Species, updated on a similar or a shorter time frame, ideally around 4 years. Next click, please. These repeat assessments, updated assessments, are what then allow calculation of the Red List Index. And then next click, please. And that is then in turn disaggregated to national levels, undergoing an annual validation process with national statistical offices and with CBD and IUCN national focal points, and then emerging from this as available for national use. Next slide, please. It's served through the Red List website. One more click there, please. Which also makes available tools such as the guidance for national and regional use of the Red List Index. Next slide, please. The scope of the Red List Index is global, and it's available for all countries as described there through the Red List website. Here's some examples of national Red List indices served through the Red List website. Next click, please. And it's also available through the annually updated country profiles of the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment tool. It's widely used by countries at the national level. For example, a study published by McKay and Lacker last year found that the Red List is used in 77% of national biodiversity strategies and action plans and national reports for countries throughout the Americas. Next slide, please. The Red List Index is widely used in a range of policy processes. It is the official Sustainable Development Goal Indicator 15.5.1, shown in the top left in the annual Sustainable Development Goals report. It's a core IPBES indicator, highlighted in the top right here at the level of the summary for policymakers of the IPBES Global Assessment. It's what could be called a founder indicator, one of the first suite of indicators incorporated into the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, as shown in the bottom, and subject to the BIP's peer review processes. It's also an official indicator for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification and for the Convention on Migratory Species, as well as being used widely in assessment processes such as the Global Biodiversity Outlook and the Global Environmental Outlook. Next slide, please. In terms of gaps in the indicator, the primary gaps are taxonomic ones. The Red List itself has a much wider coverage. So that is species groups which have only been assessed one time rather than the multiple times necessary for derivation of a Red List index. And that breadth of taxonomic coverage available across the Red List itself is shown here as illustrated in the IPBES Global Assessment. Given that a priority for coming years is Red List reassessment, not just maintenance of the reassessments of the groups already included in the Red List Index, but also additional reassessment of a number of invertebrate and plant groups to broaden the taxonomic coverage of the Red List Index. Final slide, please. The last point that we were asked to address was that of disaggregation. I've already talked about geographic disaggregations, so I'll focus here on thematic disaggregations. And the fact that the Red List incorporates required thematic documentation associated to Red List assessments allows for the generation of numerous additional policy relevant disaggregations. These are also served through the Red List website, and they include disaggregations by threats. So an example here of disaggregation of the Red List Index driven by increasing or decreasing threats from invasive alien species, obviously highly relevant to the invasive species target of the GBF. Disaggregation by biomes, particularly relevant to some of the sister biodiversity related conventions, such as the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, and ecological characteristics like migratory status, obviously highly relevant, for example, for the use in the Convention on Migratory Species. That's everything in terms of this report. Many thanks once again, and we'll be very happy to address any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. That's very clear. Good, I think we'll go to our next presentation. So we're going to have two indicators we're going to look at together here related to Goal C, indicator on monetary benefits received and indicator on non-monetary benefits. And Julie Roy from the Secretariat of the CBD is going to present the status and of these indicators. if Julie, hello, Julie.
Good morning or good time of day to everyone. So yes, my name is Julie Roy, and I'm a program officer on focusing on monitoring and reporting under the Nagoya Protocol. So I'll be sharing some information today about 3 indicators that are proposed. So they're very at the conceptual stage regarding the topic of access and benefit sharing. Next slide, please. Very quickly, so ABS is the 3rd objective of the convention. And it does seek kind of for local impact at the local level, contributing to the other 2 goals of the CBD. So we have the 3 pillars of the convention, which includes ABS. The principles of ABS are established in Article 15 of the CBD. Next slide, please. And since 2010, so we have the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. It entered into force in 2014, and it now has 135 parties. So both of the CBD, ABS under the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol will be covered in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the Nagoya Protocol, it did build on the provisions of the CBD, and there's a few other things that it brought on, but it did establish, for example, the ABS Clearinghouse, which is our information sharing platform and really ensures a key role in monitoring the utilization of genetic resources after they leave the provider country. Next slide, please. Now, turning to the draft text of the GBF, we have the wording of Goal C, which is kind of very similar to the 3rd objective of the CBD in terms of wording, with this added notion of a substantial increase in both monetary and non-monetary benefits. So there's an assumption in this goal, next please. For these benefits to flow, for ABS to happen, you do need to have mechanisms in place at the national level. So there's a clear link here between Target 13 and Goal C of the draft. So we'll be seeing a bit later on the indicator proposed for Target 13. Next slide, please. So looking at information on ABS that we have available at the Secretariat, there were 2 existing indicators. We had IT Biodiversity Target 16, which really focused on the Nagoya Protocol itself being in force and operational. So the first indicator we had was on ratification, and the second one took up the indicator developed under the SDG process. So for target 15.6, you can see here, and that indicator was the number of countries that have adopted ABS frameworks at the national level. So these are the only 2 existing indicators available on access and benefit sharing. And we can see that they're kind of more useful for a global level of analysis. And of course, from the Secretariat, we have other sources of information available on implementation as part of the review processes of the protocol, and as well the convention with national reports. Next slide, please. So thinking about monetary benefits, in 2017, we had interim national reports due under the Nagoya Protocol. We did have a question in that reporting format on benefits received from access to genetic resources or to traditional knowledge. This question wasn't mandatory, and I just prepared quickly this pie chart for you. So we had about a quarter of the countries saying, yes, they had received benefits, about a quarter saying they didn't have data available, and about half of the responses indicated that no, they hadn't received benefits, or no as in not yet, they were still working on their ABS framework. So in that process, we only had about 6 countries who voluntarily reported a numerical value for the benefits they received, and this was in various currencies. So putting that together for your information, this was between 600,000 and 700,000 US dollars. So we do see that some countries have a national baseline that is available, but this is not something that could be readily used at the global level. And then following those national reports at COP 3 in Sharm el-Sheikh, the MOB did the first assessment and review of the effectiveness of the Nagoya Protocol. They looked at the information that was available, And they also adopted this framework of indicators, which could be used to measure future progress. And again, this is more in view of global analysis. So these two indicators you see here, amount of monetary benefits in US dollars, there's already kind of a progression. So we're looking at a numerical value with a standard unit of measurement in US dollars. Next slide, please. So looking at an indicator under the GBF process for monetary benefits, we see we do have something to build on, but there's a lot that could be improved. We could think about including benefits generated by other ABS instruments. In the process, we've seen many mentions of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture and the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. So these are multilateral systems of ABS. They do have a different way of operating, but they do also have information available. In a way, they might be more experienced in collecting this type of information on benefits distributed to countries who need it the most in their context. So based on these previous slides, from the Secretariat perspective, we do see that data for this indicator could be collected in a kind of harmonized way between the CBD and Nagoya Protocol national reports. And this would be about every 4 to 5 years. So the reporting cycle is still to be determined by the upcoming meetings. But we could think about additional guidance that could be developed really to improve data quality. Now there's 3 more elements that I wanted to discuss briefly. Some of this is also relevant for the following indicator, so we'll make up the time. So for some countries, data will continue to be not available. So we saw that that was a response, and that will continue to be the case because ABS is really implemented in different ways at the national level. So we could have some countries where Indigenous peoples and local communities have established rights to grant access to genetic resources. And so the central government is telling us, well, we don't have this information. So that's a case that could arrive, that could happen. And for example, other countries may have the information, but they could have concerns about sharing it due to confidentiality in their ABS contracts. So that's another case which, from the Secretariat perspective, it should be mitigated through this aggregate reporting every 5 years, but it still could be an issue for some smaller countries with a smaller number of ABS agreements and not wanting to be able to track how many benefits they received from a specific agreement. And another response that we saw from the international courts was not applicable. So this could be countries, for example, who do not require prior informed consent for access to genetic resources. So these countries, in a way, have waived their rights over benefits that could be generated from the use of their resources. And that's also another way they've decided to implement ABS. So for these countries, simply, they could report 0 benefits as they are still implementing ABS and contributing to Goal C in the overall. For example, by having compliance mechanisms in place. And the final element I wanted to raise was, so we can look at monetary benefits, it's a dollar amount, but how can we really get more towards impact by looking at this indicator? So one possible disaggregation that we could consider would be the types of monetary benefits. So for example, is your country looking more towards access fees or kind of one-off payments that you receive initially and then maybe nothing? Or are we looking at benefits that keep giving over a longer period of time? So research grants, contributions to a national fund, that type of thing. And then there's also the type of beneficiary. So where are benefits really going? Are they reaching the local level? So here, ideally, we'd stay away from kind of a number of individuals benefiting, but you could look at some very specific things such as national research institutions that are supported financially, traditional knowledge holders or groups or individuals that are compensated for sharing their knowledge and participating in research. So these are some things that would help, at least from our perspective, in trying to get to that local level of impact, which is where the convention's logic of contributing to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity could be gleaned, at least through this indicator. Next slide, please. And now looking at non-monetary benefits, we do not have a similar baseline to go on. There haven't been previous attempts at quantification, but that's not to say that non-monetary benefits are not important. To the contrary, it's just that they are very diverse in nature and will also depend on national circumstances, what countries are prioritizing when they're negotiating their mutually agreed terms. And here I just put a few examples of what countries have reported to us as benefits, and you can see it's very diverse. Next slide, please. And so with that context, we can understand a bit more of the previous iterations of this indicator, which referred to research and development results or products. So what would be feasible, we would think so, for non-monetary benefits is looking at a proxy. So really a partial indicator that's only looking at specific types of non-monetary benefits that could be measured. And that would still give you a sense of the overall trends in non-monetary benefits. So this, the focus here was on publications and scientific collaborations that can be linked to ABS agreements. So looking a bit more at the nationality of the authors or people contributing in a research grant, for example. And so this is really a methodology that would need to development. And the Secretariat would definitely, appreciate any support or expertise to make this happen. And so this is perhaps the indicator that is the concept was less developed at this stage. So we're hoping to see further discussion on this and perhaps new proposals in the next process. And I think that's it. Next slide, please. Yes, there we go. Thank you. Happy to hear any questions from you as well on this.
Thank you very much, Julie. Yeah, that's a very good introduction to the state of play and the challenges for those indicators. We've had one or two questions in the Q&A function for you, and we'll come back to those at the end. So next, I would like to invite my colleagues from UNEP-WCMC to introduce to us the coverage of protected areas and OECMs. And I'm sure Ed will explain to us what an OECM is. Ed, please go ahead.
Great, thanks. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I'll be talking today. I'll start things off on the indicator, and then I'll be joined by my colleague Heather, who will talk about the bioeffectiveness bit towards the end. So without further ado, next slide, please. Great. So in a nutshell, boiling it all down, this is all, thank you for the next bit. This is all about the coverage of land and sea by protected areas and OECMs. So without further ado, let's explain what an OECM is. Now, I hope many, if not most of you, have heard of OECMs or are familiar with them, but these are other effective area-based conservation measures. Bit of a mouthful, but they are incredibly important. Now, with protected areas, we use a definition from all the way back in 2008, but with OECMs, the working definition or the kind of agreed definition in the CBD is only from 2018, so relatively recent, but not all that recent. It's been around for a few years now. And what they are is essentially areas other than a protected area, definition on the left there, which achieves positive and sustained long-term outcomes for biodiversity. Now, there's more to it, as you can see in the quote, but in a kind of bare bones nutshell, that's what it is. So these are areas outside of the protected area network, which is still resulting in biodiversity outcomes. Now, these are important alongside protected areas, of course, because together they make up the kind of conservation landscape, if you will, in a country or in a region And that's what we really want to get at with this, this indicator is kind of how much land and sea is covered. Now that's the bare bones. Now the next point is around disaggregations. Now the coverage of land and sea by itself is okay, but it doesn't really get to the heart of what Target 3 is about. And that's really around protecting 30%, but in areas of particular importance for biodiversity. Now that's where key biodiversity areas come in. This is a separate data set managed by BirdLife International. And we'll touch on this indicator, this disaggregation throughout this presentation. And yeah, so if you overlap protected areas and OECMs and key biodiversity areas, it's a much more useful, much more nuanced indicator, because really what you're saying there is how much of these particular areas of importance to biodiversity, how much of them are covered by protected areas and OECMs. So it's a much more useful and targeted indicator. There are other disaggregations you can do. You can do it by ecosystem, for example, by marine or freshwater, and I'll touch on that in a second. Or you can do it by effectiveness category, and Heather will touch on that in a second too. So why? Well, I've kind of touched on that already. It's incredibly important. It's a kind of baseline indicator, if you will, to track progress in a consistent way. And protected areas have often been called the kind of cornerstone of biodiversity conservation. And I agree with that statement, and that's really what this indicator is trying to kind of track. So who does it? Well, we at UNEP-WCMC, we are custodians of one part of the puzzle. We manage the data on protected areas and OECMs alongside IUCN and UNEP. And then BirdLife International are the custodians of the World Database on Key Biodiversity Areas. So together, IUCN, BirdLife International, and ourselves, we manage, well, we are the custodians of the indicator with PAs, OECMs, and KBAs, which I'll touch on a bit more in a second. So it's calculated, well, the protected area coverage is calculated every month alongside the databases on protected areas, which are updated monthly. But the overlap with KBAs, that's done more on an annual basis, can be done slightly more frequently, but that tends to be the kind of frequency. And reporting, we can go from kind of 1800s onwards. That's when protected areas start being listed in the database. And then very quickly, how is it done? Well, I'll touch on this in a bit more detail in a second, but very quickly, it's really, they're all big geospatial databases. And then we kind of push them together in specialized software using models and scripts. And then the output are these kind of tabular or CSV Excels listing the data. And it is available, has been available for quite some time. It's got quite a pedigree, just like the Redless Index has. And we're very happy to talk more about it if you want to know more. So next slide, please. Okay, so going in a bit more detail as to how it's done. As I mentioned, there are three kind of key databases here. Protected areas available via the World Database on Protected Areas. If you're not familiar with that, I fully encourage you to follow the links. I'm sure these slides will be shared, so you can follow those hyperlinks there into each database. And the size is a bit variable. The World Database on Protected Areas, for example, has hundreds of thousands of sites, whereas the OECMs, because they're more recent, is much smaller, but growing quickly, I might add. So the process, as I said, is we intersect geospatially all of these three data sets, and the overlap with each KBA is then calculated in geospatial software, and then the mean percentage of each KBA, key biodiversity area, is calculated. And the outputs are kind of shown below. At this most basic, you'll have a table like here on the left, which will just be, for example, a country shown there, or you can use it in maps. Here we actually show a different disaggregation. We show ecoregions, and you can kind of categorize each individual ecoregion based on how much coverage there is. Or here on the right, we show key biodiversity areas over time in a kind of graphical format of saying the mean percentage coverage since 2000. And we split that by ecosystem type, so terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. So these are kind of a very quick overview of the kind of outputs that you can work with and the kind of things you can embed in any kind of national reporting or subnational reporting you might do. Next slide, please. So how do we report it? Well, the mean proportion of key biodiversity areas covered by protected areas and OECMs is what we report. And we do this by country. We do it by region, SDG region, amongst others, and also globally as a kind of single global number. And as I mentioned before, you can't further disaggregate this by key biodiversity areas, which are marine or terrestrial, freshwater, or even mountain. And these are the SDG indicators. So you may have kind of seen these pop up elsewhere, and the specific indicator numbers are put there. These are reported to UNSC annually, and that's why I said this tends to be a kind of annual frequency at the very least. Now, there is metadata available. Matea kind of mentioned that earlier, but there is also metadata available for those specific indicators through the SDG kind of metadata template, which of course kind of speaks the same kind of language, makes the same points, but is slightly different. And then this last point here is just to kind of point out that these indicators definitely shouldn't simply be not relegated, but their utility goes beyond national reporting and global reporting. And there is a lot of value, I think, in looking at it at even a site scale, an individual key biodiversity area or a single protected area, looking how much is protected and where. At a landscape scale, thinking about kind of supranational landscape planning. Of course, at the national level is the obvious kind of scale at which to report it, but then also internationally, thinking about transboundary protection. There's a lot of value in this indicator and also how it can be used. So I fully encourage kind of thinking at it through those lenses too. Next slide, please. But then what about management effectiveness, you might be wondering, and that would be a good question. I think in the kind of community, we've known for a long time that coverage is not the whole answer. And that's definitely been a narrative that's been around for many years and throughout the last decade, and quite rightly so. Target 3 certainly asks for effectively managed systems of protected areas and OECMs. But gauging management effectiveness is a notoriously tricky thing to try and distill, especially in a kind of database or in a single kind of metric. And historically, we have used another database managed by us at UNEP-WCMC called the GDPAME, the Global Database on Protected Area Management Effectiveness. But that's not necessarily all we'll be using in the years to come. So recently, there's been a lot of exciting progress on this front, and there's been several expert meetings to discuss how management effectiveness might be assessed over the next decade. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Heather.
Thanks, Ed. Next slide, please. So as Ed has said, the part of this indicator that is on coverage of protected areas and OECMs is very well established. The second part of the indicator, which is by effectiveness, is in development. So as Ed mentioned, that development has recently taken the form of a series of expert workshops, the first of which was on the potential role that remote sensing could play in this indicator. The second was more generally bringing together experts to think about what would be the next steps over the next couple of years to get to a point where we have a meaningful and feasible way of measuring this by effectiveness part of the indicator. And the third workshop was an extension of that process, but specifically aimed at getting the views of parties to the CBD. Next slide, please. So there were a lot of key messages that came out of this workshop series, but I'm just going to summarize 2 of them that I think are particularly relevant. So the first is that there was general agreement that we need to go beyond just thinking about management effectiveness, and in fact, we need to be thinking about the quality of conservation outcomes when we talk about effectiveness, and that those outcomes should be linked to site level objectives. At the same time, there is general agreement that the quality of governance and management also remain important components, and that those need to be factored in as well. Next slide, please. And the second key message was that an inclusive and simple system is needed. So it shouldn't be overly complicated, and of course it should be accessible to all parties. So there's a need for robust indicators, but there's also a need for flexibility. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to give you a sense of the types of options that have come out of that workshop series for assessing this part of the indicator. So the first option is measuring it according to whether protected areas and OECMs have been assessed for effectiveness or have not been assessed for effectiveness. This is along the lines of how it's currently monitored using the global database on management effectiveness, as Ed said. The second option would be based on scores. So this would involve assessing protected areas and OECMs for effectiveness and setting thresholds to group them into levels of effectiveness. And the third option would be focusing instead on change over time. So instead of focusing on an absolute score, focusing on whether that score is improving or declining or stable over time. Next slide, please. And actually, just before I move on, one other thing I wanted to say is that building on this need for flexibility that has been raised, one of the proposals that has emerged is that 2 or more of those indicator options could be combined into a system that is kind of tiered, so that countries and site managers with less capacity or less access to data might be able to report at a sort of simpler level, with the aim that over time, more managers and more parties are reporting against those more robust indicator options. But in terms of next steps, there will be further development of this roadmap towards feasible ways of monitoring this part of the indicator. That will be summarized in an inf doc that will be submitted to the CBD COP. The way that this is implemented following the adoption of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework will, of course, depend on exactly what is adopted at that point. But one thing that we do hope to do is to expand on the global database on protected area management effectiveness to incorporate some of these emerging options for monitoring the bioeffectiveness part of the indicator. And we hope to begin to be able to calculate and make that indicator available from 2024 onwards. And of course, after that, if there's further development to be done, then we can continue to do that after that point. Next slide, please. Thank you. That is all from me. Please let me know if you have any questions.
So yeah, I'll do a little wrap up. So I think the take-home message is that it's a very multi-dimensional kind of indicator. It's incredibly useful at all kinds of different spatial scales. There are several different disaggregations that you can use, and the CBD suggests and encourages a couple, including key biodiversity areas, in particular in ecoregions and by management effectiveness. But there is also, it's kind of developing space. So please do get in touch with us if you're interested to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed and Heather, for explaining all of that, where the status is, where it's going. Then our last presentation, I'll ask Julie Roy to come back to us, where we're looking at indicators related to Target 13, which I think I'll let Lee introduce. Thank you.
Yes, hello again. So we can jump back in and go straight to the next slide, please. So looking at the wording of Target 13, it is, as I mentioned, closely linked to Goal C. So we're looking at implementing measures at global level and in all countries to facilitate access to genetic resources, fair and equitable benefit sharing. And here we also have a specific mention of associated traditional knowledge, mutually agreed terms, and prior informed consent, which are all terms also found in the text of the CBD. So the wording of this target is much more closely aligned with the previous indicators that we had under Aichi Target 16 and SDG Target 15.6. Next, please. And we can really see this as, so you're implementing measures and you're creating that enabling environment for the achievement of Goal C, which is substantially increasing benefits by 2050. Next slide, please. So looking at the indicator itself, so I did say it was closely linked to the SDG indicator, so I just wanted to go a bit into what the limitations of that existing indicator are. So the first one is that it is a binary type of indicator. So if a country has at least one measure in place on access and benefit sharing, it's a kind of yes/no scenario. So it's really a catch-all. If you have it doesn't matter what kind of measure is in place, you will be counted as having a measure and therefore having achieved the target. So there's really no incentive built in to keep working on your ABS framework and improving over time. And it also doesn't reflect anything about how operational or effective your national framework is. And so that brings us to this indicator and how we have an opportunity to really make something that could be more useful at the national level. So the concept suggested or proposed for this indicator at this stage is kind of a self-assessment that could be carried out by governments using a set of criteria, and that's why you see indicators plural. So it would be a way of looking at different aspects of what makes an effective ABS framework, and then having kind of an aggregate score that you're using to report on the indicator. So this would be really useful at the national level, and it would tell you, kind of like a checklist of what you need to focus on in your national framework to improve your score or to improve your implementation of ABS. Next slide, please. And so this methodology, it's inspired by the SDG indicator 17.14.1, which is an indicator on also having mechanisms in place for sustainable development. There's other examples here that could also be useful. So it's really looking into policy effectiveness, whatever the topic of the policy is. There's several approaches to how that can be measured. So in this context for ABS and for target 13, there is quite of a short timeline for targets to be achieved by 2030. So from the Secretariat perspective, maybe it's desirable to collect data at a higher frequency than, for example, through national reports, which, as I mentioned earlier, would be about every 4 to 5 years. So perhaps through a biannual survey that could be distributed to national focal points, we'd already have maybe at least 3 to 4 data points, so to speak, going to 2030. And maybe that also builds in kind of a learning curve for the first use of the survey that would require capacity building and guidance to be provided to the people using the survey. So I mentioned, so this is kind of like a composite indicator. We definitely need to discuss more with parties, stakeholders about which criteria would be appropriate to assess ABS frameworks. But a lot of information on national implementation is already available through national reports and the ABS clearinghouse, for example. So there's already a lot of useful sources of information for countries to use. And we would also encourage kind of consultative participatory processes in filling out this survey, especially with IPLCs, if your country has them, or relevant stakeholders involved in ABS implementation. And one important thing to consider also is, even with a very thorough methodology, guidance, etc., there would still be kind of a level of subjectivity in a self-assessment. And that's why it shouldn't be considered kind of as a ranking system between countries. It's really an indicator that would be very useful at the national level in communicating about the progress on ABS, etc. But of course, we could still kind of aggregate a median or an average of the rankings and see progress leading up to 2030. Next slide. So I've spoken about 3 concepts for ABS indicators. So I just wanted to kind of have a few closing notes about why this is important. So we know, ABS was part of the CBD in 1992, but as I think is quite obvious from my presentation, there data collection on its impact and even its implementation in some ways, quantifiable information has been limited. And we really have this opportunity through the post-2020 global biodiversity framework to fill that knowledge gap, enhance mainstreaming of ABS into other topics, and also support mobilizing resources for implementation. So target 13, for example, implementing your framework, resources are needed to achieve that target. And also, of course, no one size fits all. These ABS indicators will need to be adaptable to national circumstances. ABS is kind of a flexible instrument that can be implemented based on these different situations. And finally, so we've talked a bit about local impact through the monetary benefits. How can we get to local impact? So ABS is much more than, you know, this dollar figure or setting up procedures. It seeks for that impact at the local level. And in that sense, perhaps there's a lot to learn as well from social sciences, not only for policy effectiveness, but really looking at livelihood security and its impact on conservation at the local level. And yes, the Secretariat does need to mobilize resources and expertise to develop these indicators and build on partners' experience, namely these other multilateral ABS systems who may have experience to contribute in this regard. And next slide, please. So of course, we're inviting any interested individuals, organizations who are interested in supporting this work to contact either me or my colleague, Jillian Campbell, who's also with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Very, very helpful introduction to the subject and the issues. So now we've got about 15 minutes for questions and answers for all the speakers. And we've had some questions posted in the Q&A section. So I'm going to take a couple of those now. And the first one is on protected areas and OECM indicators. So for Ed and Heather, perhaps we want to put up the speakers on so we can see them all. And the question is, for protected areas and OECM indicators, what are the options for measuring equitably managed as an important dimension of the target? Related to that, what are the lessons learned from IT Target 11 about governance types as a possible way to measure diversity?
I can have a first go at that. That's a great question. I think, so there's a very good chance that equity could be sort of rolled up within this idea of protected area and OECM coverage by effectiveness, given that it can be considered to be a component of effectiveness. So earlier when I was talking about the need to look at conservation outcomes, but also to look at governance and management, within governance, whether governance is equitable would be one sort of important element of that. I would say that when we've been doing these consultations, there was strong resistance to the idea of some kind of a composite indicator. So people didn't like the idea of sort of having a score for outcomes, a score for governance, including equity, and a score for management, and then trying to combine those into a single score, because obviously you then lose a lot of the detail and the nuance. So that perhaps is not an option, but what could potentially be done is having perhaps the sort of the primary indicator as coverage by effectiveness based on outcomes, but also then additional indicators that are coverage by effectiveness, but with a focus on equitable governance or good governance more generally, for example. So there are different options, and as I said, this is kind of an ongoing sort of process in development. So thoughts and inputs are very welcome. In terms of lessons from IT Target 11 and governance types, I think it's clear that the World Database on Protected Areas is still very biased towards protected areas under the governance of governments. And we know that many protected areas under the governance of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and private actors are still not being reported, which is, of course, a problem because it means that we don't yet have a completely accurate baseline against which to track progress towards Target 3. So I would say that it is very important that we address that going forwards and try to make sure that the full diversity of governance types are recognized in those databases.
Great, thank you very much, Heather. I've next got a couple of questions on the Redless index for Thomas and Stuart. So I'll give you them both. You can work out how you want to answer them. One is, what checks and balances are in place to ensure that IUCN Red List of Threatened Species assessments are robust? And the other question is about how you presented how there are national versions of the Red List Index. And if you could say something about like how much is there the case that governments are officially using the IUCN Red List Index in their own government reports and work for implementation of the CBD and for the new biodiversity framework, we're looking to have global and national level indicators and reporting. So if you could say something about how to support government use of the IUCN Red List Index, and if governments have different measures or different versions of it, how to address that.
Thanks, Philip. I could take the first and then hand over to Tom for the second. So the IUCN Red List has a quite sophisticated set of procedures and structures to try and maximize the accuracy, standardization and consistency of Red List assessments upon which the Red List Index is based. And so to mention some of those, all assessments have to be independently reviewed by people who have passed the exam and are qualified Red List assessors, and they are checking for appropriate and consistent interpretation of information, application of data to the Red List criteria, and adequacy of documentation. All assessments, whoever they are undertaken by, are ultimately the responsibility and submitted by a Red List authority, which is an organization or a group that have been designated by the IUCN Species Survival Commission as responsible for the assessments for a particular set of species. So there might be a specialist group under the SSC, or in some cases institutions like BirdLife International for all the birds on the Red List. All assessments are then carefully checked and reviewed by a central Red List unit before they are published. There are various structures within IUCN that are operating to try and ensure consistency. So there's a Red List technical working group, for example, and any assessment can be challenged by anyone through a defined process that's overseen by the Standards and Petitions Committee, who are also responsible for developing the guidelines to support assessors. So a range of structures to try and ensure standardization and consistency in Red List assessments.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll pick up on your second question there, Philip. So yes, absolutely. On national application of the Red List Index, I think I touched on a couple of elements of this in the presentation, but to emphasize maybe 4 key points here. First of all, many countries undertake national Red List assessment processes. That's not all countries, and the range of coverage across those varies, as does the frequency, but it is many countries. And through efforts over the last decade or so, there is the process that I highlighted called SIS Connect, Species Information Service Connect, for establishing interoperability, flowing both directions between those national Red List processes and the global Red List. Second, through the fact that The Red List Index is adopted under the UN General Assembly as an official indicator for Sustainable Development Goal 15.5.1 in the same way as the indicators of protected area coverage of key biodiversity areas for Sustainable Development Goal indicators 14.5.1, 14.5.1, 15.1.2, and 15.4.1, as emphasized in Ed and Heather's presentation earlier. That means that there is necessarily an established annual national validation process where all of those indicators are shared through to national statistical offices and also through to CBD national focal points and IUCN government member national focal points in advance of their publication and their release at national levels through the Red List website and the IBAT country profiles. It's also worth emphasizing the temporal dimension there, because while the reassessment of individual groups of species often happens over a 4-year time frame or longer, those timeframes are offset. And so there are changes coming through in the Red List Index in aggregate in all years. So it is a temporarily dynamic indicator. And then finally, I think also mentioned there are a range of tools available for supporting national derivation and national application of the Red List indices available through the Red List website. And I draw particular attention to the guidance for application of Red List indices at national levels. Thanks very much. Stu, anything to add to that?
No, all good. Thanks, Tom.
Great. Thanks very much, Tom and Stu. Very good. I've now got a couple of questions for Julie. And then after that, we'll, I think, probably go to closing remarks. And I'd like to ask Campbell if you would like to say anything from the Secretariat of CBD and also SEQ. So Julie, we had a couple of questions about ABS indicators. One is, what about also an indicator like the number of community protocols drafted, agreed, or signed, and especially in the context of protecting traditional knowledge and the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities? And then the second question is more about the process of developing the indicators in relation to the negotiations. Will they be discussed in next week in Geneva or only during COP? Or what would be the process that you envisage for developing the indicators?
Thank you, Philip. I'll take the first one on community protocols and IPLCs. This is definitely interesting because, you know, our main interlocutors at the Secretariat are the national focal points who are located, you know, in the central government. And so it's difficult sometimes to get that information from the ground level and how IPLCs are implementing ABS, what benefit they're receiving. And so I think that's something that's being discussed now in the post-2020 process and the role of non-state actors in perhaps writing directly that information. And also to note that, I mean, we've been focusing here on headline indicators, but there will be a complete set of indicators. And I think what you mentioned is definitely interesting to look at. And finally, I don't think the linkages between all these targets and goals has been clearly determined at this point, but in terms of goal C and this substantial increase in benefits, it would definitely be interesting to consider also linkages to target 21 on participation of IPLCs in decision making. So this also applies to negotiating ABS in some ways. Now, the second question on the process to develop these ABS indicators, Jillian, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add after this, but it's been a challenge for us, at least at the Secretariat, through these virtual negotiations, So in July or August, we issued an information document on ADS indicators, so raising kind of these suggestions and proposals for the meeting of the open-ended working group that took place in August. But there really wasn't time at that meeting to go into these proposals and these details. So we're really looking forward to Geneva meetings to hear some feedback from parties. So most of the feedback we've received to date through statements, etc., it's been more, not idealistic, but aspirational. So looking at this indicator should cover this, but not looking at specific proposals. So hopefully we'll have progress on that. And my understanding is that we're not expecting all the indicators to be fully developed for COP15, but at least to have, wording is agreed upon, and you have at least a work plan, partners identified to support the development of that indicator. Jillian, did you want to add anything to that? I don't know if she's still online.
I mean, I think that captures the state of affairs. I'm not sure how much we will get into sort of that it should be in the monitoring framework, but in terms of actually going into detail to get rolled out, it's more likely to be left to an expert group, which is being proposed, but maybe Ezekiel.
Okay, I think we'll conclude there with the questions. There was one question that was asked about Goal C and questions about what it, interpretation of it and so on. I'm not going to put that question to the panelists just because actually these webinars are about the indicators and help us to understand the indicators. There are lots of very valid questions about the wording and definitions in the targets, and therefore what the indicators have been measured, but that's not actually what we're going to look at today in these webinars. That'll be for next week in Geneva. And so I would like to ask whether Gillian would like to make any concluding remarks. Gillian, your internet quality was not very good. If we could just have your on speech but not video, hopefully that would do. And also Ezekiel, if you would like to say something. Gillian, would you like to say any concluding remarks to today's webinar and perhaps the series of 4 webinars?
Sure. I mean, I think that the webinars have been really excellent in terms of providing information on the state of different indicators. And when considering the discussions that's happened so far at all of the meetings leading up to the COP, so at the subsidiary bodies and also at the working group meetings, there has been a huge emphasis on how important it is to have better monitoring to ensure that there is national capacity for monitoring and that this information is brought into national biodiversity planning and reporting processes and also is used for global and regional assessments so that at all levels there's the information that's needed in order to guide biodiversity decision making. And I think this is something that has really been widely supported across all parties and all the meetings from my observations. In terms of how the monitoring framework will work, there are some differing opinions, of course. And so this is exactly what's going to be discussed in Geneva, is how do countries balance the need for high quality information that captures all of the goals and targets with the constraints in terms of how much you can actually build your biodiversity monitoring system in the next decade. And what's the minimum set of information that we need in order to really be able to make these decisions? And so I think that this is an excellent step forward in terms of how these webinars can support the process, as it provides information on what it is that different indicators, what questions different indicators can answer, how ready they are to be taken up by countries, where are the gaps, and where do we need to go? And of course, there are some gaps, but I do think that another thing that parties have well recognized in the process is that there is this interest in investing in monitoring capacity. And so it's not that we're going to say that we have to solve everything overnight, but how do we solve everything in the next few years so that we're not asking ourselves in the next decade how we can monitor key aspects of biodiversity. So that's it for me. And if Hezekiah wants to add anything, I'll hand over to him as well.
Thank you very much, Julian and Philip, and to everybody participating in this last webinar. This is the closure of a cycle, as I said at the beginning, of 4 webinars where we've been seeing the variety of topics that, in this case, for this new framework, we will need to address, moving from the fundamental information on the species and ecosystems and protected areas, the very biological ones, let's say, to other areas like economics and benefit sharing, information on sustainable use, ways to measure, in the understanding that this information is key for the future, and to be more effective than the previous framework on inclusion and participation of the various sectors. So the monitoring framework will be essential to see at global level how are we doing, but also at national level, and with the right indicators and the right data and availability based on robust methodologies, can also be inspiring for countries to go one step beyond every time, to stimulate, to get away from the comfort zone and to see through data if we are performing properly in our vision to live in harmony with nature. There's still a lot to be done. There's still a lot to be agreed in the next few weeks in Geneva to have a good basis, a good structure for the monitoring framework. And as we saw in the different presentations, we are not departing from zero. We had a look on the most advanced, let's say, types of information that will be or can be part of the framework, and still work to be done under the expert group, the ATEC, that will be established after COP during intersessional period. Once the framework is agreed, needs to be complemented with different elements. So this is a process we're going together, but I think we have, as we saw during these days, a good basis with robust information behind to back up and to complement information from parties to see the national and the global perspective. So thank you very much to all of you for the organization and the participation in presentations, and also attendees and questions. And again, see you in Geneva for those who are able to travel, and I look forward to work with you in an active and constructive participation for keep building this framework that will be very important for the next decade. Thank you very much to all. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Ezekiel. Thank you very much to our colleagues in the Secretariat and CBD. Thank you to our presenters for preparing and delivering so well your presentations, and thank, of course, to everybody for participating in today and in the 4 webinars we've had. Thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing to take all of this process, this journey forward, for, as Ezekiel said, for all of us to have the information and indicators we need. Thank you very much. So I will conclude the webinar here. Stay safe, wish you well, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Gracias, adiós.